Late in the afternoon on Wednesday, February 20th, 1980, Catherine Foster sat on the cold metal bleachers beside her university's soccer fields. The men's team at the University of South Alabama was playing a practice game, and it was very easy for Catherine to pick out her favorite player. He was the very tall and handsome one with dark and curly hair. His name was Tom Jadon, and he'd been Catherine's boyfriend for years, ever since they went to high school together in the small city of Pascagoula, Mississippi. Catherine and Tom were young, both just 18-year-old freshmen, but they were committed to each other. When they were seniors in high school, Tom received a soccer scholarship to the University of South Alabama in Mobile, so Catherine enrolled in the same school just to be near him. Catherine had earned the second highest grades in her entire graduating class, and so she could have gone to college anywhere, but realistically, it did not feel like a sacrifice for her to follow Tom to this school. The University of South Alabama was well known for its physical therapy program, which was Catherine's specialty, and so having her boyfriend there just made college that much better. While Tom and his teammates played soccer, Catherine called out to two young women looking up at the bleachers from the grass below. One was tall and thin, this was Tish O'Sullivan, and the other was shorter and more athletic-looking, and her name was Jamie Kellum. And these two were Catherine's best friends, and when they saw Catherine calling to them, they smiled and rushed up to her and sat down on either side of her. And for a moment, all three young women just sat there and watched Tom and the other players out on the soccer field, but then the coach blew the whistle and called all the players to the sidelines. And so suddenly there was not soccer to watch, and so the three friends stopped looking at the field and they just looked to each other and began chatting. Catherine had known Tish since they were in elementary school. They'd gone to the same Catholic church and the same high school in Pascagoula, but Catherine had not met Jamie until her first day of college. She and Tish had been standing in line for registration, and Jamie happened to be in front of them. They got to talking and realized Jamie was also from Pascagoula. She had just gone to a different high school. That's why they didn't know her. And so the three young women bonded over their shared background, and ever since that fateful meeting, they'd been inseparable. They all loved the energy of living in a big city for the first time, and lately, the women had been keeping an eye on a brand new mall that was under construction in downtown Mobile. Jamie leaned over and told her friends that she thought the mall was actually finally open now, and so they should go check it out the next day. Catherine and Tish loved the idea, and none of them had anything to do in the morning, so they could go shopping, have lunch, and still be back in time for afternoon classes. So they agreed to meet in the parking lot outside of Catherine's dorm building around 10 a.m. the next day. Just then, Catherine's boyfriend Tom came jogging over. He was sweaty and his curly hair was sticking to his forehead, but Catherine didn't care. She gave him a big kiss on the cheek and then took his hand. Then all four friends headed for the university dining hall for dinner before settling in for another evening of studies. The following morning, Catherine woke up before her alarm and she immediately rolled out of bed and jumped in the shower. After that, she went to her closet and picked out a comfortable outfit for the cool morning: blue jeans, brown walking shoes, and a light sweatshirt. Then she sat in front of her mirror and swiped on some eyeshadow, mascara, and lip gloss. She blow-dried her curly light brown hair, thought about putting it up in a ponytail, but ultimately decided she liked it better down. And so Catherine was ready, early, like always. But just then, at about 9:30 a.m., she heard a knock at her door, and so she went to answer it. She smiled when she saw Jamie standing there. Jamie said she knew she was early, but she figured Catherine would be ready too, and she was right. Catherine laughed at how well they knew each other, and then the pair walked out to Jamie's car. But before they actually got to the car, Catherine stopped and said she had forgotten her purse. So she turned and ran back to her dorm to grab it while Jamie waited. Jamie leaned against the side of her vehicle and crossed her arms over her chest against the morning chill. After a few minutes, when still Catherine had not come back outside again, Jamie was so cold that she climbed inside of her car and turned it on, put on the heat, and turned on some music. And as she was sitting there waiting, it started to feel like Catherine was taking a really long time. Jamie thought about maybe going inside to check on her, but she told herself, Catherine's fine, she'll be out in a second. But after 3 more songs played and still Catherine had not come back out again, Jamie really started to get worried. But just then, she looked up and noticed Tish walking across the parking lot towards her, and so Jamie rolled down the window and actually yelled to Tish, like, "Hey, come over here." And so Tish, sensing something was wrong, she ran over. And when the two women linked up, Jamie explained that Catherine had apparently lost her purse and gone back inside, but that was like 15 minutes ago and she still had not come back yet. Tish agreed that was weird, and it was not like Catherine to suddenly abandon her friends. And even if Catherine could not find her purse and that was the reason it was taking so long, she would have come back by now to tell them that was what was going on so they wouldn't worry. Also, remember, these were the days before cell phones, so a phone call or text message was just not an option. Tish could only think of one explanation. Maybe Catherine had run into her boyfriend, Tom, and decided to go hang out with him instead. It was definitely strange that Catherine never returned to let Jamie know, but the girls knew Catherine was head over heels in love with her boyfriend, and so that did kind of seem like something that could happen. Jamie nodded at this idea and agreed that Catherine could have dumped them for her boyfriend. But Tish had a class with Catherine later that afternoon, and so they'd be able to figure out what happened then. So Tish and Jamie, after waiting for a few more minutes and still not seeing Catherine, they decided to just go ahead with their shopping trip without Catherine. Tish got into the car, and the two young women pulled out of the parking lot and headed for the new mall in downtown Mobile. Later that afternoon, Tish burst into the university library. She walked quickly down the rows of books until she found Tom sitting alone at a table with his head in a textbook. Tish sat next to him and tried to keep her voice at a whisper as she asked Tom where on earth Catherine was. But Tom just stared at her and said he didn't know, because he hadn't seen his girlfriend all day. He thought she'd gone shopping with Tish and Jamie that morning, and he assumed that right now she likely just got out of her afternoon class. Tish suddenly felt panicked. She told Tom that Catherine actually didn't go shopping with them that morning because she basically just kind of abandoned them, and she didn't show up to class, and she wasn't in her dorm room now. Nobody had seen her since before 10 a.m., and so now Tish and Jamie were running all around campus looking for her. Tom did look alarmed, but he told Tish there had to be a reasonable explanation here. He closed his textbook and thought for a moment. He said the only thing that could make Catherine miss class would be an emergency, which made him wonder if maybe something had happened with Catherine's family back in Pascagoula. Tom asked Tish if she had called Catherine's parents, and Tish said no, but she would right now. And sure enough, she rushed out of the library and headed towards her dorm room where she could use the phone. That evening, Sergeant Wilbur Williams was working dispatch at the Mobile police station. He was one of the younger cops with a dark brown mustache and a police hat that actually looked like it was 2 sizes too big on him. When the phone rang, he picked it up and he heard a woman's frantic voice on the other end. She introduced herself as Joanne Foster. She said her daughter, Catherine, was a freshman at the University of South Alabama. Right away, Sergeant Williams' ears perked up. He'd actually graduated from the same university. Mrs. Foster continued, saying she'd received a call from one of her daughter's closest friends telling her that Catherine had not been seen since earlier that morning. And Mrs. Foster said her daughter was not at home, so she had no idea where she was. Sergeant Williams listened, but he actually was not that concerned. He told Mrs. Foster that, because of partying and all these new experiences all around them, that it's pretty common for college freshmen to sort of drop off the map for a few hours from time to time. The sergeant promised the panicked mother that she really did not need to worry, that her daughter would show up. And on the off chance that she did not show up, the Mobile police would launch an investigation, but only after 24 hours had passed. That was the department policy. 24 hours later, on Friday, February 22nd, Sergeant Williams found himself back on his old college campus. The cement sidewalks and tall red brick buildings were familiar and made him nostalgic for his college days. And it would have been a whole lot better to be back here if it were not under such bad circumstances. Catherine Foster still had not been located after almost a day and a half, so the Mobile PD had officially opened up a missing person investigation, and Sergeant Williams was in charge. Now, Sergeant Williams still believed that Catherine would show up soon on her own, but he could see that all of Catherine's friends were very worried about her. In fact, Tom, Tish, and Jamie were so worried about her that they had all individually contacted campus security about her disappearance. So Sergeant Williams decided he would begin his investigation by speaking with those 3 first. He started with Jamie, but really Jamie didn't know much. She explained how Catherine had left her to go get her purse that Thursday morning, but then never came back. And Jamie said, since then, she's just been looking for Catherine like the rest of her friends. Tish knew even less than Jamie did. All she could say was that Catherine missed her afternoon class on Thursday and was absent from classes that Friday morning, which was apparently really out of character for Catherine. Finally, Sergeant Williams talked to Tom. Tom would say that he and Catherine spoke every single day, and so it was totally unlike her to go this long without speaking to him. Sergeant Williams appreciated the information Jamie, Tish, and Tom provided, but it really wasn't that much. And so after speaking to Tom, Sergeant Williams spent the afternoon just kind of walking around campus, speaking to Catherine's teachers and classmates, seeing if anybody knew anything. But nobody had any information that could actually help find Catherine. And so by nightfall, Catherine was still missing, and Sergeant Williams had no idea where to look for her. The following day, Saturday, February 23rd, Tish marched arm in arm with about 50 other students, including Tom and Jamie. They joined a volunteer search party to look for Catherine under the supervision of Sergeant Williams and another officer. The search party had already scanned the entire main campus, but they'd found nothing. So around 10 a.m., 48 hours since Catherine was last seen, the police expanded their search to forested areas surrounding the university. Tish and the other volunteers kept their arms hooked together as they made their way through the trees. The police had told them that even something as tiny as a hair clip could help them find Catherine. So Tish kept her eyes locked on the crunchy brown grass, watching for anything out of the ordinary. Then, from far down the line of students, Tish heard someone scream out in terror. Her stomach dropped as she watched two police officers run towards the commotion. Without thinking, Tish just followed them and ran headfirst into the most horrifying thing she'd ever seen. Her best friend, Catherine, was there, lying on her back in the grass, motionless. Everything about her looked pristine. She was wearing her favorite blue jeans sweatshirt, her hair was fanned out around her face, her makeup wasn't even smudged. It almost looked like Catherine had just laid down for a nap, except for the puddle of blood beneath her head. Suddenly, Tish heard another student scream, and she watched Jamie drop to her knees and sob into her hands. As more people joined the crowd, Tish saw Tom running up to see what was going on. But before Tom could get a glimpse of his girlfriend, Sergeant Williams began pushing the students back and grabbed Tom by the arm. The sergeant told him this was a crime scene now, and so they had to secure the area. Another officer quickly began wrapping yellow crime scene tape around the trees, creating a large perimeter around Catherine's body. And as this was happening, Sergeant Williams did his best to hide his shock. He had truly believed that Catherine would just show up again with a simple explanation for her absence. But now, of course, everything had changed. A student had been murdered on Sergeant Williams's former college campus, and he felt like it was now his responsibility to solve the case, especially when you consider the fact that he had kind of brushed off Catherine's mom's concerns initially. Sergeant Williams did an initial sweep of the area immediately around Catherine, but there wasn't much to find. The dirt and grass around Catherine's body did not look disturbed. There were no footprints, drag marks, or signs of a struggle. There was no blood anywhere except right beneath Catherine's head. Sergeant Williams couldn't find any signs of a weapon either. Soon, a few other Mobile Police Department officers showed up, along with the county medical examiner. Staff from the medical examiner's office lifted Catherine's body up and then placed it into a body bag. Then they carried the bag to the coroner's van so her remains could be transferred to the county morgue for an autopsy. A few hours later, Sergeant Williams arrived at the morgue to meet with the medical examiner about Catherine's cause of death. The two men sat down in the medical examiner's office, each holding a cup of much-needed coffee, while the medical examiner explained he had uncovered some crucial information. Catherine had died from 2 gunshots from a .22 caliber gun, 1 bullet in the back of her skull and the other in her right temple. Otherwise, her body showed no signs of assault or indications that she had been bound or beaten in any way. The medical examiner also said her body showed little signs of decomposition, which made him think that Catherine had only been dead for maybe 8 to 24 hours before her body was found. Sergeant Williams thought this over. Catherine disappeared on the morning of Thursday, February 21st, but based on the medical examiner's estimation, she was not killed until at least 1 full day later. It sounded like Catherine might have been kidnapped and then held captive for more than 24 hours before she was killed. But it also appeared that she was never restrained and never fought against her killer, so how could she possibly have been kidnapped? Sergeant Williams didn't really know how to make sense of these sort of contradictory clues, but he thanked the medical examiner and headed back to the police station. He knew he had a lot of work to do. The moment Sergeant Williams walked inside the Mobile police station, another officer stopped him. The officer said they had just received a call from a female student at the University of South Alabama who lived near where the body was found. The student said she'd woken up with an asthma attack at exactly 2:38 a.m. on Saturday, February 23rd. She knew the precise time because she recalled, sitting up and struggling to breathe and just looking over at the clock, and it was right there, 2:38. So at 2:38 a.m., the student had jumped out of bed and opened her window to get some fresh air, and that's when she heard two loud popping sounds. Now, at the time, she had no idea what these noises were, but since obviously hearing the news about Catherine's death, the student wondered if those popping sounds might have been the sounds of the gunshots that killed Catherine. As he listened, Sergeant Williams felt his heartbeat speed up. 2:30 a.m. on Saturday was about 8 hours before Catherine's body was found, and so that lined up perfectly with Catherine's estimated time of death based on the autopsy. And so the student might very well have heard the two gunshots that killed Catherine. Sergeant Williams ran out to his police cruiser and headed right back towards the university. A few minutes later, Sergeant Williams strode across campus with a purpose. Now he was investigating a murder, so he had to go back to square one, which meant re-interviewing Catherine's closest friends. He needed to ask each of them where they were at 2:30 a.m. on Saturday, February 23rd. Now, when he spoke to them, he didn't tell them that that was the time he believed Catherine was killed. He just wanted to know if the teenagers had alibis. Jamie, Tish, and Tom were all extremely emotional over Catherine's death. It was hard for Jamie to even speak, but she did manage to tell Sergeant Williams that on Saturday night, she had been at a sleepover with a friend and a few family members, and Sergeant Williams was able to follow up and confirm that this was true. So Jamie had an alibi. As for Tish and Tom, they didn't really have an alibi. They just said they were in their dorm room sleeping, and they knew there was no way to prove that because there were no cameras or other monitoring systems in their dorm buildings. But they both swore they didn't go anywhere besides their dorm that night. Sergeant Williams thought Tish sounded like she was telling the truth, though he wasn't quite sure about Tom. There was just something in the sergeant's gut that made him feel suspicious of Catherine's boyfriend. But he didn't have any real evidence against Tom, so he kept his suspicions to himself, for now. After speaking to the three friends, Sergeant Williams began looking at a very different theory as to what happened to Catherine. Maybe she was abducted by a stranger. And so Sergeant Williams left campus and headed back to the police station where he could comb through the city's criminal records. Later on Saturday evening, Sergeant Williams sat at his desk thumbing through a thick stack of papers. He pulled out all the records regarding violent crimes on and around the University of South Alabama, and now he was poring through each one, looking for anybody that could be a potential suspect in Catherine's murder. Sergeant Williams' eyes began to glaze over from looking at so many documents, but then one of the documents caught his attention. It was a report about a crime that had taken place several months before Catherine's murder near the university campus. A female student said she'd been walking near the woods when a truck pulled up beside her and the driver offered her a ride back to school. The young woman agreed and got into the passenger seat of the truck, and as soon as she did, the man reached over and tried to sexually assault her. She fought him off and jumped out of the truck, but as she was running away, the man pulled out a gun and shot her. Luckily, the bullet hit her in the leg, so it didn't kill her, and so she was able to get away and call the police and press charges, including attempted rape and assault with a deadly weapon. But there was one more detail that popped out to Sergeant Williams. The man who attacked the student was currently employed at the University of South Alabama in the maintenance department. Sergeant Williams couldn't believe it. He made arrangements to bring the maintenance worker in for questioning as soon as possible. The next morning, Sunday, February 24th, Sergeant Williams sat across from the maintenance worker inside of an interview room at the police station. The sergeant got right to the point and asked the maintenance worker where he'd been at around 2:30 a.m. on February 23rd. The man said he'd been working an overnight shift in a part of the campus that was relatively far from where Catherine's body was found. To Sergeant Williams, this did not make this guy seem less suspicious. All it did is it showed this maintenance worker was fully awake and on campus at the time that Catherine was killed, probably on campus. But then Sergeant Williams called the maintenance worker's boss, who would say, the worker was under his supervision the entire night and he never disappeared. And so even though this maintenance worker actually had a pretty extensive and ugly criminal record, Williams just had no way to actually link him to the murder, and so he ended up telling the maintenance worker that he was free to go. However, the interview was not a total loss, because the conversation got Williams thinking of a new possibility. He remembered the medical examiner saying that Catherine didn't have any defensive wounds that would come from an assault. So he thought maybe she had gone into the woods where she was ultimately killed with a person who she trusted, like somebody who worked at the university, somebody in a position of authority. Sergeant Williams followed this hunch, and later on Sunday, he was back in the police station interview room with his newest people of interest, the 2 University of South Alabama security guards who'd been on duty the night Catherine died. Both men had been patrolling the campus on Saturday night around 2:30 a.m., and they claimed they always spent their entire shifts together when they worked overnight. The sergeant thought it was awfully convenient that each of these officers were able to provide an alibi for the other. For all Williams knew, they could just be covering for each other. But then, the security guard said they did remember something out of the ordinary happening that night. A little past 2:30 a.m., they heard 2 loud popping sounds. At first, they thought maybe the noise was coming from students shooting off fireworks, but they never confirmed that and didn't do any more follow-up, so they said it was possible those sounds could have been gunshots. Sergeant Williams was pleased. Even though these guards clearly had alibis, and so Williams had to let them go, he did now have 2 more witnesses who might have heard the shots that killed Catherine. After the guards were gone, Williams reviewed all the information he'd collected. So far, he had quizzed 6 potential suspects about their whereabouts at the time of Catherine's death, and all of them had a good alibi. And since, for now, he was sort of out of potential other suspects to go investigate, he decided he would just turn his attention towards a new goal. He wanted to find the gun that killed Catherine, because obviously that could lead him to the killer. Sergeant Williams and the Mobile Police Department spent the next several days interviewing people and also scouring the campus for the gun. February 28th marked 1 week since Catherine had disappeared and 5 days since her body had been found, and they still had very little evidence to go on. That afternoon, Sergeant Williams stood outside the university library, looking on as another officer stuck his arms into a small duck pond. Sergeant Williams almost wanted to laugh because it seemed so unlikely that a murderer would dump their murder weapon into such a tiny pond, but then this officer who was reaching into the pond suddenly shouted and held his arm up in the air. Sergeant Williams could see sunlight glinting off the object in the officer's hands. It was a small silver handgun. Sergeant Williams ran up to this officer to look more closely, and he realized the gun was a .22 caliber, just like the gun used to kill Catherine Foster. But Williams's excitement soon turned to disappointment when they sent this gun in for ballistics testing, and it did not match the gun that killed Catherine. The police were back at square one again. Investigators continued looking for leads, but as time went on, the tips dried up and they were not able to make a big breakthrough. So the case went cold, and it stayed that way for the next 3 years. But still, this case haunted Sergeant Williams, who had a habit of cracking back open Catherine's case file at least once a week. So, on February 18th of 1983, the details of Catherine's case were still very fresh in his mind. And that morning, he got a very interesting phone call. It was a call from a first responder who told Sergeant Williams that a man had been found dead of an apparent suicide inside of a house that was right near the University of South Alabama campus. And this first responder said anybody involved in the Catherine Foster investigation should really come here and see the inside of this deceased guy's home. Sergeant Williams and another officer immediately went straight to this address, and what they found inside was absolutely chilling. The man's body was still in the house, and it looked like he'd been dead for at least 3 to 4 days. But that's not what caught the sergeant's attention. It was what he found in the man's bedroom. Tacked up on the wall were news clippings about Catherine Foster's murder. There were photos of her from the local paper and copies of her autopsy report, which the man had highlighted and written on. He'd even written poems about the crime. It was like a shrine to Catherine and her murder. Then Sergeant Williams checked inside the man's closet, where he found a bunch of white button-up shirts with the logo of the company that provided security at the University of South Alabama. Sergeant Williams knew he recognized the man lying dead inside of the house. His name was Michael Maris. He was one of the campus security guards who'd been working on the night Catherine died. Sergeant Williams had interviewed him 3 years earlier, and he'd had an alibi for the night of the murder, or at least that's what Sergeant Williams thought. Sergeant Williams went through every inch of Michael's home, and in the attic above the garage, he found yet another chilling scene. Sitting up there in the dark was a big cage that was actually big enough for an adult to stand up inside of and actually walk around inside of. It was made out of chicken wire and had a lock on the outside, while on the inside, there was a mattress and pillows. A gruesome picture of Catherine locked inside of this cage formed in Sergeant Williams's mind. Suddenly, everything made sense. Maybe Michael had kidnapped Catherine and held her in this cage inside of his house before ultimately taking her out to the woods and killing her. Sergeant Williams rushed back to the police station and immediately contacted the other security guard who'd been working the night of Catherine's death. And this other guard swore up and down that he really had been telling the truth 3 years earlier. He was with Michael that entire night, and they had nothing to do with this. Sergeant Williams hung up the phone. He guessed it was possible that maybe Michael was not the killer, even though he had a creepy fixation on Catherine's murder, but how could anyone explain that cage he had up in his attic? The sergeant contacted Michael's next of kin and asked about the bizarre chicken wire enclosure. Michael's family member said that the cage was actually where Michael often kept his grandfather, who suffered from dementia and had a tendency to wander around the neighborhood. It was not meant to be cruel, it was just a measure they used to keep the grandfather safe. And just like that, Sergeant Williams's hot lead started going cold. For years after this, Sergeant Williams kept reading Catherine's case file at least once a week, hoping for a lead that just never came. And eventually, Sergeant Williams left the police force, leaving behind the murder he was obsessed with unsolved. By 2002, so 22 years after Catherine's murder, another officer named Mike Morgan had taken over the now very cold Catherine murder case. He was young, much as Sergeant Williams had been back in 1980, and he had close-cropped blonde hair, small blue eyes, and a long face. On December 4th of 2002, Officer Morgan got a surprising call at the Mobile police station. The man on the other end said he was a police officer in Pascagoula, Mississippi, which was Catherine Foster's hometown. He told Officer Morgan that a witness had come into the Pascagoula police station with information regarding Catherine's murder. Officer Morgan's heart started to race. By now, the unsolved murder was like an urban legend among college students and police officers in the area, a mystery that might never be solved. Morgan never imagined he'd actually get a break in this case. Officer Morgan told the officer in Pascagoula that he wanted to speak to this new witness in person. So he hung up the phone and rushed out the door to make the 40-minute drive to Mississippi. Less than an hour later, Officer Morgan was sitting in the Pascagoula police station with his heart still going a mile a minute. But the story that this witness ultimately told him was so incredible that Officer Morgan wasn't sure if he even believed it. It went against everything the Mobile Police Department thought they knew about Catherine's murder. Officer Morgan told this witness that he couldn't believe these wild claims unless he saw real proof. And this witness said Officer Morgan could see all the proof he could ever need if he just went to this one really specific address. So the officer got back in his police cruiser and he headed to that specific address. Morgan pulled up in front of a totally unassuming residential home. The owner was working in the yard and they looked up when they heard a car pull up. Officer Morgan got out of the car, approached the owner, and explained why he was there. And so the homeowner then led the officer into the house and to a set of storage lockers. The owner unlocked one, pulled out the item that Morgan was asking for, and he handed it over. And the second Morgan looked down at this thing in his hands, he knew he had just solved Catherine Foster's 22-year-old murder. Based on the investigation that was done into this item, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to Catherine Foster on the morning of February 21st, 1980. Catherine's killer felt very confident. They were sitting behind the wheel of their car, and when they saw Catherine walking outside of her dorm building, they jumped into action. They pulled up alongside her and began honking the horn and waving to her. Catherine looked over and her face lit up. She recognized the driver, and she was really excited to see them. Catherine ran over and hopped into the passenger seat. They chatted as they drove away from the university, but they didn't go very far. Catherine's killer rolled to a stop beside a wooded area just off campus and said they just remembered something. They said they needed a specific type of plant for a botany class they were taking. So they asked Catherine would they come into the forest with them and help them find it. And Catherine said, yeah, of course. And so the pair walked along the crunchy brown grass into the trees, and as they walked along, Catherine, who had her head down and was scanning the ground diligently for this plant, she began getting maybe a few steps ahead of her killer. And when this happened, and the killer realized Catherine was distracted, the killer stopped and just stood there staring at Catherine with rage burning inside of them. Then the killer quietly slipped off their backpack and then reached inside and began feeling around. And eventually they felt the .22 caliber pistol they had stolen from their grandmother, and they pulled it out, and without any hesitation, the killer raised that gun and aimed it right at the back of Catherine's head, and then they fired. But amazingly, Catherine did not fall down after getting shot in the head. Instead, she slowly turned around to look at her killer. Her eyes were wide with shock and confusion, and for a second, the two just stood there in silence, staring, until Catherine fell to the ground. But Catherine's killer could tell Catherine was not dead. She was still breathing. So they casually raised the gun again and fired a shot into her temple to make sure she was dead. Then the killer got out of the forest as fast as they could, and when they emerged from the trees, they tossed their grandmother's pistol into the nearest dumpster. Then they got back into their car, drove away from the crime scene, and went about their day like everything was perfectly normal. They didn't speak a word about what they had done for the next 22 years. But it would turn out trying to keep this horrible secret inside took a real toll on the killer. They began abusing drugs and alcohol, and eventually, in 2001, they joined an Alcoholics Anonymous group in Pascagoula in the hopes of getting sober. And as part of Alcoholics Anonymous, they began working through the famous 12-step program. Each step is designed to help people get to the root of their alcohol abuse and overcome it. And as part of Step 8, Catherine's killer was instructed to make a list of everyone they had ever wronged, and Catherine's name was right at the top of that list. But the killer ran into a problem. Step 9 was about making amends to these people they had wronged. But Catherine was obviously dead, and so the killer didn't know how to apologize to someone who was not alive. So Catherine's killer confided in another member of their Alcoholics Anonymous group, explaining exactly what they'd done to Catherine Foster. And this other person said the best way to make amends would be to write Catherine an apology letter and read it over her grave. And that's exactly what the killer did. In late 2002, they stood in the cemetery where Catherine was buried in Pascagoula, Mississippi, holding a handwritten letter. They looked around to make sure they were alone, and then they read their apology out loud. The letter said, "Dear Catherine, after all these years, I have come to you. It is me, Jamie, the girl who took your life." It would turn out one of Catherine's two so-called best friends, Jamie Kellum, was actually her killer. The story about how Catherine had said she needed to go back into her dorm to get her purse and then she went missing, that was all a total lie told by Jamie to cover for herself. Officer Mike Morgan had figured this out through the witness who had come into the Pascagoula police station back in December of 2002. That witness was the Alcoholics Anonymous group member who Jamie had confided in, the one who suggested she write the apology letter. But after hearing about what Jamie had done, the witness just could not bear to keep the secret, and so they told Officer Morgan everything. And then they also told Officer Morgan the specific address of where this letter was currently located, because that was obviously the proof Officer Morgan needed. And this address led Officer Morgan to Jamie's stepfather's house, where apparently Jamie had hidden this letter inside of a locker. And so when Morgan asked the stepfather for the letter, Jamie's stepfather replied, quote, "You mean the letter?" So it sounded an awful lot like the stepfather knew what the note contained. And the letter didn't just contain Jamie's confession about killing Catherine, it also detailed her motive for killing Catherine. Although nobody knew it back in 1980, Jamie was absolutely obsessed with Catherine's boyfriend, Tom, the tall, handsome soccer player. Jamie and Tom had met long before either of them went to the University of South Alabama. They'd crossed paths at a tennis tournament during high school, and while Tom did not really remember Jamie, she never forgot him. She kept tabs on him through the gossip in their small Mississippi hometown. In 1979, she found out Tom was in a serious long-term relationship with Catherine Foster, and that both of them were heading to the University of South Alabama for college. Jamie had received tennis scholarships to multiple schools in the southern United States, but she chose to go to the University of South Alabama, where she did not receive any scholarship money, for the sole purpose of secretly following Tom. And the day that Jamie met Catherine and Tish magically in the registration line, and they all became best friends, that was not a coincidence. She intentionally inserted herself into that friend group to be closer to Tom. And then she began taking pictures of Tom and showing them to her family, claiming that he was actually her boyfriend. She even kept a lock of Tom's hair. Now, Tom had no idea this was happening, and neither did Catherine. But as Jamie realized that breaking up the young couple was going to be harder than she thought, she got more and more desperate. She wanted to get Catherine out of the way, and she believed there was only one way to do that: to murder Catherine. So she carried out the crime, then casually went shopping with Tish at the new mall like nothing happened. And then Jamie got really lucky because the medical examiner incorrectly estimated the time of Catherine's death at 8 to 24 hours before the body was found, when in reality, Jamie had actually killed Catherine about 48 hours before. And Jamie had a great alibi for that window that the medical examiner had identified. She was with family and friends. And so as a result, police never really suspected Jamie at all. On November 21st of 2008, Officer Mike Morgan and another member of the Mobile Police Department pulled up outside of a blue and white colonial-style home in Jackson, Mississippi. It was a shelter house for people experiencing homelessness, and they knew Jamie had been living there for a while. When police looked into the yard, they saw there was a middle-aged woman with long graying hair just staring back at them. Officer Morgan got out of the car, but before he could even say anything, the woman actually yelled out to them. She said her name was Jamie, and she already knew the police were there to arrest her. Jamie got in the police cruiser without any resistance. Once they got back to the Mobile police station, she immediately confessed to killing Catherine Foster. Jamie would later try to claim she was innocent, but ultimately a jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. In 1935, the city of Sydney, Australia, had a shark attack problem. There had been 8 attacks in the last year alone, 6 of which had been fatal. And every time it happened, the local newspapers would write stories describing the scenes in graphic detail. They would call the sharks monsters and recount how they'd latched onto some poor teenager and shaken their body around like a rag doll. Certainly, these stories fueled the public's fear of sharks, but they also inspired fascination. People were amazed by the power and ferociousness of these creatures, and so they wanted to see them up close. Luckily, Bert Hobson was more than happy to oblige them. Bert and his brother Charlie owned the Coogee Beach Aquarium in Sydney. During the warmer months, the aquarium was used as a public swimming pool, but during the winter and fall, when it was too cold to swim, Bert would pump ocean water into the pool and then fill it with all kinds of aquatic creatures for visitors to see. But nothing got more people through the aquarium door than a shark. Even as the country struggled to pull itself out of the Great Depression, which was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, a shark could still draw big crowds and big money. Over the last few years, Bert had managed to capture and exhibit more than 20 sharks, but the problem was none of the sharks lived very long. They typically died within just a few weeks of being in captivity. And so the Hobson brothers were always on the hunt for a new shark. This was especially true in April of 1935 because Coogee Beach was going to play host to a massive parade in honor of Anzac Day. Anzac Day is a national day of remembrance in Australia and New Zealand that primarily is about honoring fallen soldiers. Tens of thousands of people were scheduled to attend the event on April 25th, and Bert figured if he could catch a shark, the aquarium could capitalize on some of that holiday foot traffic. So, on the morning of April 18th, Bert headed out onto the water in his big fishing boat. The day before, he'd set some fishing lines about 1.5 miles from the beach and baited them with chunks of mackerel, hoping that when he returned, he'd find a shark tangled up in his lines. And Bert would not be disappointed. That day, when he checked the lines, there was this massive 14.5-foot long tiger shark ensnared in his trap. Even more exciting for Bert was the shark was exhausted and not trying to put up a fight. It had clearly spent the night before struggling to free itself, and now it just didn't have the energy to resist Bert reeling it in. So Bert grabbed the lines and attached them to his boat, and then he towed the shark back to the aquarium where it was put into the pool. Looking down at his prize swimming around the tank, Bert was sure this huge shark was going to be a massive media sensation. And Bert would be right, although not for the reasons he expected. The Hobson brothers bought ad space in all the major local newspapers announcing their newest attraction. They called it the largest tiger shark ever in captivity, and that may actually have been true. Most tiger sharks are 10 to 14 feet in length, and this one was 14.5 feet long. The prospect of seeing this giant creature attracted a massive crowd. However, for most of the week leading up to Anzac Day, the prized shark didn't put on much of a show. It barely ate, and then when it did, it just kind of seemed docile and slow. It certainly was not living up to the ferocious monster hype the brothers had been selling. But then something strange happened. On Anzac Day, Thursday, April 25th, the brothers opened their aquarium early to try to capitalize on as much of the pre-parade foot traffic as they could, but again, that day, the shark just kind of swam slowly around and barely ate, and so by late afternoon, only about a dozen people were still watching the shark. And just as those last dozen or so people were getting ready to leave the aquarium right around 4:30 p.m., the shark started acting weird. Without warning, the shark just started thrashing violently around in the water. Its body was moving so fast and its tail was flapping so aggressively that it practically beat the water to a foam. The spectators had absolutely no idea what was going on, but they were completely mesmerized by the spectacle of it. The shark then started rapidly swimming in circles around the pool, periodically smashing into the walls. And then, all of a sudden, the shark just stopped swimming. And for a moment, it just floated motionless in the center of the pool, and then it just sank to the bottom. At first, all the onlookers assumed the shark must have died. But then they started to see this stuff rising up through the water just above the shark. And when this stuff got to the surface, it formed this mass of chunky, putrid scum that smelled and looked like vomit. And in fact, that's what it was. Vomiting is a fairly common behavior in sharks. When they get stressed out, like when they're caught in nets or beached, or when they've been dragged from their habitat and then put in a pool that's too small for them, they sometimes throw up. The behavior is even more common in tiger sharks because tiger sharks will eat pretty much anything that crosses their path, including things they can't digest, like turtle shells and metal, which is why they're always having to throw up to get these things out of their body. But no one in the audience knew this, so as this pool of shark vomit was beginning to settle on the surface of the water, the spectators just stared at it, trying to understand what it was. And as they were looking, they started to notice these shapes inside of the vomit that they sort of recognized. At first, what they saw were things like fish bones and shark fins, the kind of things you would expect to find in the stomach of a shark. But then there were also these other things that you wouldn't really expect to see, like a dead rat and a partially digested bird. And then they noticed something else, a human arm, and this arm had a rope tied around its wrist. The spectators were horrified. They started gasping and screaming and shouting for someone to call the police. Bert Hobson grabbed a stick and did his best to push the arm over to the side of the pool while his brother Charlie rushed inside to call the authorities. By the time the cops arrived, the shark had recovered from its sickness and was back to swimming slow laps around the pool. So the first thing the cops had to do was secure the arm before the shark decided it was hungry again. The detectives lifted the arm from the water using the rope around its wrist, and then they placed it inside of a burlap bag they'd brought to collect evidence. And then the police turned their attention to the obvious question everyone had. How did this arm wind up inside of this shark? The Hobson brothers assured the police there was no way someone could have thrown the arm into the pool without their knowledge because the shark had been under constant surveillance since arriving at the aquarium 7 days earlier. There was also no way someone could have fallen into the pool during off hours because they kept the aquarium locked when they weren't there. So the Hobson brothers were certain that the arm must have already been in the shark's belly when it arrived at their aquarium. And the victim, whoever they were, was likely just another casualty of the latest wave of shark attacks in Sydney's harbors. But the police weren't so sure about that theory, at least not the part about a random shark attack. To them, the rope tied around the arm's wrist seemed to suggest something more intentional, possibly murder or maybe suicide. They didn't know, but something seemed off. But regardless, the police knew their first order of business was just identifying the owner of the arm so that their family could be notified about their death. Now, in 1935, under normal circumstances, trying to figure out whose arm this was would be nearly impossible because DNA had not been discovered yet. And so all investigators could do was just look at the arm and see if there were any features on it that could lead to the owner. And in this case, there were. The first thing they noticed was that the arm was in shockingly good condition. In fact, there appeared to be hardly any signs of digestion at all, which was surprising considering how long it must have been in the shark's stomach. So before the police even left the aquarium, they called a fingerprinting specialist who drove out to the site and then cut and peeled the skin off the fingertips for later analysis. The second thing the police noticed was a tattoo on the inner forearm. It was an illustration of two boxers facing off as if they were in the ring. Their bodies and gloves were drawn in blue ink, and their boxing shorts were colored red. The design was unique enough that police felt hopeful a friend or family member might recognize it just from a written description in the newspaper. But when the police drove over to the morgue to have the arm analyzed further, what they would learn there would ensure that all the newspapers in the state would be running much more than just a written description of that tattoo. At the morgue, the local medical officer became instantly fixated on the question of how the arm had come to be removed from the owner's body. Up to that point, everyone, including most of the police, assumed the shark had just bitten the arm off. But to the medical officer, the arm did not look like it had been bitten off at all. There were none of the ragged tears or bite marks like you'd expect to see with a shark attack. Instead, the arm appeared to have been cut from the body with surgical precision, most likely with a knife, which meant this death was likely not the result of a shark attack. In all likelihood, it was a murder by a person, and then after this guy was killed, the shark was either fed the body part, or after the parts were dumped into the water, the shark happened to find the arm and ate it. This new twist on the case created an instant media frenzy. Newspapers all over the country ran stories about this strange situation with the shark arm in Sydney. And a bunch of those papers actually ran a photo of the tattoo, along with instructions for readers to contact the authorities if they recognized it. And someone did. On April 28th, just 3 days after the scene at the aquarium, police received a call from a guy saying he'd seen the photo of the tattoo in the paper, and he knew who the arm belonged to. Without a doubt, the guy said, that arm belongs to my older brother, Jim Smith. To most of the police at the precinct, the name Jim Smith meant nothing. But for Detective Frank Matthews, the man who would be leading the so-called shark arm case, hearing the name Jim Smith would completely change the way he was thinking about the investigation ahead of him. Because Matthews knew that Jim could not have been just a random victim. About a year earlier, Jim had become a secret police informant. It started with an insurance fraud scheme gone wrong. Some wealthy men had bought a yacht called the Pathfinder, and then they over-insured it. They then hired Jim to be the captain of the Pathfinder, and his job was to drive and maintain the boat, and then, at an appointed date and time, sink it. The wealthy men would then cash in the insurance claim and split the proceeds amongst those involved in the scheme. But when Jim was actively sinking the boat as ordered, a water policeman saw it happening and yelled out, offering to help. But Jim panicked and just pretended not to hear the police officer, allowing the boat to continue to sink. And so later on, when the wealthy men tried to file their insurance claim on the boat, that water policeman remembered that strange encounter with Jim, and before long, the insurance claim was flagged for fraud. Detective Matthews had been assigned to that case, and Jim was one of the first people brought in for questioning. But as soon as they started talking, Jim broke down completely and told the detective everything. In exchange for immunity, Jim promised to supply Detective Matthews with information on Sydney's vast criminal underworld. This was an extremely dangerous trade for Jim to make. Because of the massive financial fallout caused by the Great Depression, desperation had driven many otherwise law-abiding Sydney residents to participate in some capacity in this criminal underworld. And people like Jim, who snitched to the police, threatened their livelihood. So, when Detective Matthews heard that the shark arm victim was Jim Smith, he assumed that someone must have found out that Jim was a police informant and they had had him killed to shut him up. But the detective didn't reveal any of this to Jim's brother when they spoke. He simply asked the brother to come down to the station and give a formal statement, which he agreed to do. The next morning, Jim's brother arrived at the police station, and with him was Jim's wife. She fought back tears as she told police it had been more than 10 days since she or anyone else had seen Jim. The last time they spoke to him, he said he'd been hired to take a wealthy man out on a fishing trip. He said he didn't know how long he'd be gone, but he'd be staying at a cabin on the coast, and if they needed to reach him, he would be checking his messages at the Hotel Cecil in Cronulla. Cronulla is one of Sydney's many coastal suburbs. By this point, Detective Matthews could tell this was going to be a very challenging investigation with a lot of media scrutiny. And part of him wondered if maybe he was jumping to conclusions. Maybe Jim hadn't been murdered. Maybe he really had just been attacked by a shark. And if he had, then most likely the rest of Jim's body, or at least more of his body, would be inside of that tiger shark. And as it happened, that tiger shark had actually died shortly after vomiting up Jim's arm. And so Detective Matthews went to the dock where the shark's body was being held by a fish oil merchant, and there he watched as the giant fish was cut open and nothing but fish parts fell out of it. This was enough to convince Matthews that this was no animal attack. Jim had to have been murdered by a person. So he tipped his hat to the fish oil merchant and headed back to the station where he would make plans for the next phase of the investigation, canvassing Cronulla, where Jim had told his wife he would be checking his messages. The first place police were sent in Cronulla was the bar at the Hotel Cecil, and immediately police got a hit. When the bartender saw a photo of Jim, he instantly told police that he recognized him, and even called him by name. He said, "That's Jim Smith." Apparently, Jim had visited this bar on several occasions, enough to be on a first-name basis with the bartender, and also the bartender said Jim was just a very memorable guy. He was tall and athletic, and at one point he trained to be a boxer, which is why he had that tattoo on his forearm of the two boxers. But the bartender said it had been a long time since Jim had come around. The last time he saw Jim was the evening of April 8th. Jim arrived in the early afternoon and stayed for several hours, drinking beer and playing dominoes with the locals, and then around 6 p.m., he left with a friend called Mr. Williams, a man that the bartender described as being very, very short. Detective Matthews knew who the bartender was talking about, and he also knew that this very short man was not named Mr. Williams. The real name of the short man was Paddy Brady, and Matthews knew he was a very close friend of Jim's. Paddy was well known to police as a master forger. He'd picked up the talent in his 20s while he was in the military. Paddy had been in and out of jail on a regular basis since he was 11 years old. In fact, the police had an active warrant out for his arrest in connection with some forging charges, which Matthews assumed was the reason Paddy was going around using a fake name. He didn't want to get arrested. But despite being a career criminal, Paddy was not known to be a violent criminal. So even though Paddy seemed like he could have been the last person to see Jim alive, the combination of him being Jim's close friend and Paddy being non-violent made it hard for investigators to believe that he might have had anything to do with Jim's murder. But over the next few days, as police continued speaking to residents of Cronulla, it started to seem like Paddy had in fact done harm to his friend. The information police gathered in Cronulla led them to a cottage on the water in Cronulla, and this cottage was being rented by Paddy. and apparently on April 8th, after Jim and Patty had left the Hotel Cecil, the pair had traveled by boat to this cottage and gone inside together, but the next day, only Patty came out, and after that, no one heard from Jim again. Initially, police couldn't think of a good reason why Patty might want to kill his friend, but when Matthews followed up on where Patty went on April 9th, so the morning after he and Jim had gone into the cottage together, a theory started to form in Matthews' head. Matthews learned that on the morning of April 9th, Patty left the cottage and headed for a taxi depot. The driver of the taxi told police that Patty looked disheveled and totally out of it. Patty asked the driver to take him to McMahon's Point, a wealthy community on Sydney's North Shore. The driver dropped Patty off outside of this large fancy house right above the water, and he watched Patty go inside. Patty would stay in the house for about 40 minutes, and then he would call another cab to come pick him up and drive him back to Cronulla. Some of the detectives wondered who a guy like Patty would be visiting in a fancy place like McMahon's Point, but Detective Matthews knew exactly which house the driver was talking about, and he knew exactly who lived there. The house belonged to a well-known businessman named Reginald Holmes. Back in the 1850s, Holmes's father was considered to be the best boat builder in Sydney. He built luxury yachts and speedboats, and he made an absolute fortune selling them. And then, when he retired, he handed the whole boating empire over to his oldest son, Reginald. For decades, the Holmes family lived like royalty in Sydney Harbor. But then the Great Depression hit, and Holmes's yacht-building business, like all other luxury businesses, went downhill fast. So, to maintain his luxury lifestyle and preserve the prestige of his name, Reginald Holmes had found other ways of making money. Mostly, he used his boats to facilitate drug smuggling off the coast of Sydney Harbor. Many people were involved, but hardly anyone ever got in trouble for it because at the time, there were only 2 cops in Sydney assigned to drug cases. But the thing that put Holmes on Matthews' radar was the sinking of the Pathfinder. Remember how Jim became an informant after a couple of wealthy men hired him to sink their yacht, the Pathfinder? Well, Detective Matthews had recently discovered that Reginald Holmes and his close friend Albert Stannard were those 2 wealthy men. The only reason Matthews had not pursued charges against them was that they had withdrawn their insurance claim after he had started investigating them. At this point, the police felt nearly certain that Holmes had to be involved somehow in Jim's death. There were just too many coincidences. But they didn't have enough evidence to actually charge Holmes with anything. So instead, they went after Patty. At 6:30 p.m. on May 16th, police arrested Patty at his home and drove him back to the precinct where he was subjected to more than 6 hours of questioning. But in all that time, Patty skirted every one of the investigators' questions and barely broke a sweat. Unlike Jim, Patty was a career criminal who lived by a sort of code of honor, meaning he would never snitch. But Patty also realized that he was facing murder charges, which meant he could be facing the death penalty if he was convicted. So, eventually, Patty's code kind of eroded, and he made a calculated decision. If he was going to be forced to take the fall for Jim's death, he was going to make sure that Holmes went down with him. Patty told police in an official statement that he'd first met Holmes about a year earlier, back when Jim had been hired to be the captain of the Pathfinder. But after that big insurance scam failed with the Pathfinder, Patty said that Jim was left without any money because he didn't get paid for the scam. And so he and Patty came up with a new scam and presented it to Holmes. The idea was to forge checks from Holmes's wealthier clients in amounts so small that the clients wouldn't notice. Holmes would supply the checks, Patty would forge the signatures, and Jim would cash the checks from his account. And then all 3 men would split the profits. It's unclear why someone like Reginald Holmes would sign up for such a high-risk, low-reward kind of scam, but reading between the lines in Patty's statement, Detective Matthews considered the possibility that perhaps Jim was angry about not getting paid for the Pathfinder job, and he might have told Holmes that if he didn't cooperate with he and Patty's forging scam, that Jim would go to police about Holmes's role in the Pathfinder insurance scam. Whatever the motivation was, Holmes agreed to participate with Patty and Jim. And for a long time, their scam worked, and the 3 men made some nice money. Eventually, though, Jim and Patty got greedy and decided they wanted to level up the scam operation. They wanted to forge a check for a whopping £620. which, for reference, would be worth more than £11,000 today when adjusted for inflation. Holmes agreed and produced the check, and in the week leading up to Jim's disappearance, Patty visited Holmes's house many times to practice forging the signature. In fact, according to Patty's statement, that was why he visited Holmes on the morning of April 9th. But when it came to the death of his friend Jim Smith, Patty said he didn't know anything. He said that when he left the cabin that morning on April 9th to go to Holmes's house, Jim was alive and well. The police weren't sure if they believed Patty's version of events, but his statement gave them what they needed to go after Holmes. So the next morning, Holmes was brought in for questioning. Holmes was only 44 years old and he'd lived a life of immense privilege, but when he walked into the police station on May 17th, he seemed much older and more frail than a 44-year-old should be. There were rumors that after the Pathfinder scam had failed, Holmes had had a nervous breakdown and he had begun self-medicating with alcohol and cocaine. The police presented Holmes with a copy of Patty's statement, but after Holmes read it, he denied every word. Not only did he claim to have no idea what Patty was talking about in the statement, Holmes told police that he didn't even know who Patty was, and he certainly had never visited Holmes's house. Obviously, the police knew this was a lie. But Holmes was a powerful person with powerful lawyers, and for the time being, the police could not force him to talk. Instead, they made another move against Patty. On Sunday, May 19th, the news hit the papers. Patty was officially being charged with the murder of Jim Smith. There would be a public trial, which meant if Patty stuck to his story, Holmes would be compelled to testify in front of the press about both his shady business dealings and the death of Jim Smith. Holmes knew that that kind of media attention would ruin him and his family. So, on the morning of May 20th, a day after Patty was officially charged with murder, Holmes got up early and headed down to the harbor. The weather was cold and foggy, but Holmes was determined to get out on the water. So he walked to the wharf, where his friend and co-conspirator, Albert Stannard, kept a small boatyard. Stannard wasn't at the harbor just yet, but Holmes found one of Stannard's employees who was just starting to set up for the day. Holmes asked the employee if he could borrow one of Albert's speedboats for a quick ride along the coastline. The employee could easily tell that Holmes was drunk, but he knew that Holmes was a skilled boater and a close friend of his boss, so he said, "Sure, I'll get you set up." The man filled the boat with fuel and oil and then pushed it out onto the water. Holmes climbed in, threw the boat into high gear, and sped away from the dock. It was only about 7:30 in the morning, and the ordinary people of Sydney were just beginning to board their commuter ferries across the harbor. But Holmes appeared to be on a mission. As he headed east toward open water, his eyes stared straight ahead. He pushed the boat to go faster and faster until tears were streaming out of his eyes. And then he abruptly cut the engine. As the boat gently rocked in the waves, Holmes found himself staring at a particular stretch of coastline, Piper Point, the most expensive suburb in all of Sydney. He thought about all the people he knew who lived there and imagined them reading the horrible headlines that were sure to be written about him during the upcoming trial. With his eyes looking straight ahead, Holmes reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a bottle of brandy. There wasn't much left in the bottle, but he gulped down the last of it and then threw the bottle over his shoulder. And then Holmes reached back into his pocket and pulled out a revolver. And there, within full view of the people who lived on Piper Point, Holmes pointed the gun at his forehead and pulled the trigger. The gun went off and the blast threw Holmes's body out of the boat and into the water. But, shockingly, he survived. The bullet hit the thickest part of his forehead, so instead of puncturing his skull, it just sort of flattened there against his forehead and then fell to the ground, leaving him with a giant flesh wound on his face. As soon as Holmes hit the water, he bobbed back to the surface like a cork, and for a second he just looked around wondering what happened while blood gushed from his forehead. Then he just swam back over to his boat and climbed inside. Meanwhile, the residents of Piper Point, who had actually seen the attempted suicide, began calling the police. The water police were dispatched to the area, and they raced towards the injured boater, but as soon as they got close to his boat, Holmes would just turn his boat around and speed away. This happened over and over again, with the water police trying to get close enough to help, and Holmes cutting the wheel sharply and rushing away from them at the last second. And even though Holmes periodically would pass out behind the wheel, either from blood loss or drunkenness or both, he still managed to evade the water police for more than 4 hours. Finally, Detective Matthews and his squad were notified of what was going on out on the water, and so they headed out in their own boat, and with the help of Holmes's own brother in another boat, they were able to finally jump on board of Holmes's craft and tackle him and pull the keys out of his ignition. Holmes was taken back to shore and sent immediately to the hospital, and then 5 days later, when Holmes was finally healthy enough, he told detectives he was ready to talk. Holmes told police that Patty had been blackmailing him for months, threatening to reveal what he knew about the Pathfinder insurance scam if Holmes didn't pay him. But then, on the morning of April 9th, the morning after Jim was last seen at the cottage with Patty had come to Holmes's house looking disheveled and carrying a big brown leather bag. Patty told Holmes that he'd been with Jim at the cottage the night before, but they'd gotten into a fight that ended with Jim getting killed. So Patty had loaded Jim's body into a tin trunk he found at the cottage and disposed of it by dumping it into the water. But apparently, not all of Jim's body had fit inside of that tin trunk. Holmes said that at that point, Patty reached into this brown leather bag he had with him, and he pulled out Jim's arm, holding it by a rope that he had tied around the wrist. Holmes said this scared him so badly that he immediately decided to just do whatever Patty wanted in fear that Patty might kill him too. And so from that point onward, whenever Patty called to ask for money, Holmes would give it to him. To the police handling the interrogation, Holmes seemed genuinely afraid as he spoke. He chain-smoked and his hands shook when he signed his statement, but it was impossible to tell if he was afraid of Patty or of the stain this case was going to leave on his reputation. In any case, the majority of the details in his story lined up with what the police had uncovered in their investigation. So they asked Holmes if he would be willing to testify that Patty killed Jim and disposed of Jim's body, and Holmes said he would. Now, not all of the detectives believed that Patty was guilty. The idea that this tiny guy could have killed this huge athletic guy, Jim, who had literally been at one point a professional fighter, seemed totally implausible. But with all the media attention on this case, the police were facing an immense amount of pressure to just close it. And since they still couldn't find Jim's body, Holmes' story was their best shot at closing the case. Before Holmes left the station, the detectives asked him if he wanted police protection, but Holmes declined. Before Patty could officially be indicted for murder, the police would have to present their evidence to the coroner. In cases where a wrongful death is suspected, it is the coroner's job to determine the cause of death and who may have been responsible. On May 30th, the lead detectives were called to the office of the coroner to present all of the information they had uncovered in the case of Jim Smith's death. But after presenting all their evidence, the coroner told them that there was not yet enough information to determine how Jim Smith had died, and so they would have to have an inquest. An inquest is a judicial inquiry to ascertain the facts relating to an incident, such as a death. The date for the inquest was set for June 12th, which meant detectives had just 2 weeks to prepare all of their evidence and just 2 weeks to hopefully finally find Jim's body. But at the end of those 2 weeks, despite searching the water extensively, police did not locate Jim's body, which meant pretty much their entire case against Patty would rest on the testimony of Reginald Holmes, a man who just weeks earlier had publicly demonstrated that he was both dangerous and mentally unstable. And as the days until the inquest ticked by, Holmes's mental health only seemed to worsen. He spent entire days drinking in his bed, scared that if he went outside, he would be killed, either for what he'd said to police or for what he might say on the stand at the inquest. And it would turn out his fears were legitimate. In the early hours of June 12th, the day of the inquest, a police officer was making his rounds when he noticed a car idling by the side of the road. Its headlights were on, and the passenger door was open, and the driver was just kind of sitting there, leaning forward. June is wintertime in Australia, and in a coastal city like Sydney, the wind that sweeps in from the harbor can be extremely cold. And so worried something was wrong because this guy's door is open, The patrolman quickly got out of his car and he hustled over to the idling car to see what was happening. The patrolman came around to the open passenger door and shined a flashlight on the driver. And right away, he saw the driver was covered in blood and had been shot several times on the left side of their body. By the time the sun came out and people started gathering outside the courtroom for the inquest, the story had already hit the papers. Reginald Holmes had been murdered, only 7 hours before he was scheduled to testify at the inquest. Without the police's star witness, the case against Patty Brady was bound to fail. For one thing, the police had no direct evidence tying Patty to Jim's murder, but as it would turn out, that wasn't even their biggest problem. At the inquest, which did end up happening, Patty's lawyer would argue that the court could not find Patty responsible for Jim's death since there was actually no hard evidence that Jim was even dead. All they knew was Jim was missing an arm, and people can survive without an arm. And since this was technically true, the coroner was determined to have no authority to hold this inquest, which meant they had to shut it down. Patty would be acquitted of all charges. However, he would spend the rest of his life going in and out of jail for other offenses. Jim's body would never be found, and no one would ever be convicted for his murder. Nor would anyone ever be convicted for the murder of Reginald Holmes. Although some people believe Holmes's murder was orchestrated by his old friend and co-conspirator Albert Stannard, either to help his family collect on one of his many life insurance policies, or to avoid him ruining both of their reputations by testifying at the inquest that would implicate both of them. Many people in Sydney considered these outcomes to be a huge miscarriage of justice and a total failure on the part of the police. But many other people in Sydney were quietly relieved that the people involved in this very bizarre shark arm case took their secrets of Sydney's underworld with them to the grave.
You call my name when the night feels wrong. I play the part, but I don't belong. You leave her world, but not too far, and I wait here beneath your scars. Your touch feels real, but your heart's away. It beats for her, though you let it stray. I'm holding a bar.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the Amazon Music follow button invites you over to their house for dinner, bring your trash with you and secretly hide it around their home. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen's. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen's Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to